Godzilla is the ultimate destruction of Japan. Godzilla is the enduring strength of Japan. Together, the King of the Monsters embodies a nation's darkest moments and its greatest triumphs. And when Japan faced one of its greatest disasters, it was time for Gojira to return in his most terrifying vision ever. After first being brought to life by Ishiro Honda in 1954's Gojira, the King of the Monsters went through decades of evolution that saw him become the kid-friendly protector of Japan, restarted as a morally gray force of nature, finally acquisitioned by American studios for a disaster, reclaimed by Japan in a modern form that flamed out, and returned to the US for a cinematic universe. But after lying dormant in Japan for 12 years, Gojira would return under a creative vision that not only sought to compete with his increasingly popular blockbuster interpretation, but address a nation's modern fears in ways few Godzilla films had ever done. As we've discussed, Godzilla has evolved across 4 distinct periods: Showa, Heisei, Millennium, and Reiwa. And it was the Reiwa era that brought Godzilla back to Japan after Toho Studios had seemingly put their King Kaiju into permanent hibernation, which began in 2016 and is still happening today, so far encompassing 1 live-action theatrical movie, an animated trilogy, and a series of smaller productions. This larger period of sporadic Gojira revitalization has given rise to several different disconnected Japanese reinterpretations of the King of the Monsters. But as I reach the end of my Godzilla retrospective series, I only want to talk about one of these visions. Here we'll explore Hideaki Anno's Shin Gojira, tracking its production, revitalization of Toho's star monster, the nuclear disaster that led to its creation, its connections to Anno's classic anime, and what this new vision of Godzilla means within the context of nearly 70 years of the King of the Monsters. Plus, stick around for a ranking of every Godzilla movie. Together, these created a vision that is both the most terrifying interpretation of Gojira ever brought to life, and a story that both critiques and praises Japan in ways that only Gojira and Anno could ever do. After releasing 6 films annually, Toho Studios' Millennium era came to a close with the ambitious and financially disastrous Godzilla Final Wars in 2004. Cue a decade without Godzilla that resulted in Legendary Pictures and Gareth Edwards' Godzilla in 2014 and the Monsterverse. And really, Toho wasn't all that interested in making more Godzilla pictures, as it was Yoshimitsu Banno that initiated the preliminary work and deals that led to the Monsterverse, with Toho more a passive partner in the process. Unlike the years in between other eras that were marked with multiple proposed but never made Godzilla films, 2004 through 2010 was only marked by Banno's unmade Godzilla 3D and the American work that occurred mostly without Toho's involvement. And then, something terrible happened. On March 11, 2011, a 9.0 magnitude undersea megathrust earthquake shook the Pacific Ocean off the coast of the Oshiku Peninsula of the Tohoku region of Japan. The incident, known sometimes as the Great East Japan Earthquake, and also referred to as simply Santen Ichi-Ichi, was the most powerful Japanese earthquake ever recorded, and the 4th most powerful recorded earthquake ever. The shock triggered a massive tsunami that sent huge waves measuring up to 40.5 meters high and as fast as 700 kilometers an hour into Japan. In the span of minutes, the Tohoku earthquake and tsunami caused a reported 19,747 deaths, 6,242 injuries, and 2,556 missing people. In addition, hundreds of thousands of residents were forced to temporarily or permanently relocate. But the effects weren't over. The earthquake and tsunami damaged the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant in Okuma, Fukushima, due to the combination of electrical power for cooling systems being lost and backup power that would support ventilation failing. The accumulated gases within containment units built up and exploded, causing a meltdown of 3 reactors in what became the worst nuclear accident since Chernobyl in 1986, and the only other disaster to be classified as a level 7 on the International Nuclear Event Scale. The disaster forced the evacuation of 154,000 residents, as radiation was released into the atmosphere, and large amounts of contaminated water were released into the Pacific Ocean, which continued for years until an ice wall of frozen earth was built to stop the contaminated water. But the sudden compromise of Fukushima exposed that the cascading events leading to the meltdown were foreseeable, and could have been prevented if it weren't for the lax oversight by the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry. Slow and negligent responses from the Japanese government exacerbated the disaster, with evacuation and health advisory information ignored, officials forbidden from using the phrase core meltdown at press conferences, and Prime Minister Naoto Kan and his cabinet unprepared for the crisis without emergency outside help. Rigid bureaucracy, hesitating to send bad news to officials, an inability to make decisions, and constant internal confusion were all cited as Japan's government struggled to respond. Altogether, the earthquake, tsunami, and meltdown created the worst disaster that Japan had experienced since the nuclear bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, leaving the country reeling and struggling to cope with the widespread destruction and loss of life. And it's within the aftermath of this disaster that Gojira was given new relevancy. After each Godzilla era ended, you can see Toho evaluating whether or not they should bring the King of the Monsters back to the screen, weighing audience burnout and the trend of decreasing profits across each era against the financial possibilities of bringing Godzilla back. And unlike a lot of US studios, Toho often leaned toward hesitancy and letting the property rest, instead of inundating audiences with non-stop relaunches, which is why Millennium quickly fell apart when it broke this trend. While every Godzilla era has a lot of films crammed into a short span of years, the gaps between them and the massive amount of time over which all of these films have been made have helped prevent permanent Godzilla fatigue. For Toho, Godzilla is one of our top priorities, said Toho producer Akihiro Yamauchi at the time of Shin Gojira's premiere. But after Final Wars, we felt it wasn't the right time for Godzilla movies. 10 years passed, and we realized there would be an entire generation who weren't familiar with Godzilla, so 3 years ago, we decided to go for it. In addition, Yamauchi cited the wave of fear and anxiety in Japan that resulted from the 2011 disaster as the impetus, with Toho finding it important to use Godzilla as a symbol to depict that fear and anxiety. With Toho set on Godzilla's modern resurgence, the studio sought out Hideaki Anno in January 2013 to bring the new vision to life. But Anno, who began his career as an animator, had come to fame with his anime Neon Genesis Evangelion in 1995, directed several live-action features, and had been at work on his rebuild of Evangelion since 2005, refused while coping with a bout of depression. A representative from Toho contacted me directly, saying, "We'd like to direct a new Godzilla film," said Anno. At the time, I was still recovering from EVA 3.0, and right on the spot, flatly refused the offer. It's impossible. Even to begin work on the next EVA is impossible. However, Anno's longtime friend and frequent collaborator Shinji Higuchi convinced Anno to take the offer, with the director halting work on the final Evangelion rebuild film in favor of Godzilla. In March 2015, Toho announced that Anno and Higuchi would co-direct their new Gojira film, with Anno writing the script and directing the film while Higuchi, who was the special effects director on Shusuke Kaneko's Heisei Gamera trilogy, would be the VFX director. Shin Gojira would debut in Japan on July 29, 2016, and then around the world in the following months, eventually being given a limited release in the US in October, making it the first Japanese Godzilla film with a North American premiere since Godzilla 2000. And since Toho had ended the Heisei era to allow for TriStar's Godzilla in 1998, and the Millennium era ended long before Legendary's Monsterverse in 2014, Shin Gojira would be the first time that Toho would produce a Godzilla film to directly rival its concurrent US counterparts. And the result was major box office success in Japan, selling more than 5.3 million tickets and earning 8.25 billion yen, and an additional $1.9 million from the US and Canada, making it the second highest grossing film of 2016 in Japan, and the most popular Gojira movie since the Showa era. Following its release, Shin Godzilla would be nominated for many different awards, including 11 for the Japan Academy Prize, winning 7 including Best Picture and Best Director. After decades of Toho trying to reignite the popularity of their star kaiju, Gojira had finally reclaimed his glory. And it's thanks to a story that directly responded to a nation once again facing the fears that had created Gojira in the first place. Shortly after production on the film was announced, Anno published a short essay online explaining how he came through a bout of deep depression after Evangelion 3.0, and why he had chosen to create a Gojira film. With the creator writing, "I decided to take the job because I arrived at the conclusion that I had the desire to see fantastical science fiction revived, instead of just being a continuation of the past. I decided to take the job because I knew that if I didn't take on another new piece, something that wasn't Eva, I wouldn't be able to move forward. In the world of fantastical sci-fi, Godzilla isn't just an embodiment of hopes and dreams, but a caricature of reality. Almost a kind of satirical reflection of the world. Painting present-day Japan in that light is something of a crazy experiment. And it's the two sides of satire and hope, fantasy and reality, that balance on a knife edge of horror that defines Anno's rebuild of Gojira. Set in present day, Shin Gojira opens with the discovery of an abandoned yacht named the Glory Maru in Tokyo Bay, immediately echoing the original Gojira's freighter the Ayaku Maru, and evoking the Daigo Fukuryu Maru, the Japanese fishing boat that was exposed to nuclear fallout due to US weapons testing and a major inspiration behind Honda's original film. Almost immediately, an unseen massive creature breaches the Tokyo Bay aqualine, with only its enormous tail and a spout of steam visible to investigators, sending Japanese government officials scrambling to understand what's happening. But any reservations about studying the creature are quickly pushed aside when the second form of the monster, soon to be known as Gojira, pushes into Tokyo through a river, destroying everything in its way and piling up boats and debris on its back. And here is where Anno's film makes its real-world allegories undeniably clear, as the burgeoning Gojira reflects the images of the 2011 tsunami, pushing further and further inland as those who thought they were safe are suddenly running from danger. Quickly, Anno's film reveals the satirical edge to its real-world inspired horror, as the Prime Minister's live address to calm the nation and assure that Gojira will quickly die under its own weight is interrupted by the creature leaving the river and crawling on its belly across the streets and buildings. Anno is skewering the inaction of his government that worsened the Fukushima meltdown, but he never lampoons the innocent victims caught in the way of Gojira's rampage. The further along Shin Gojira goes, the more frustrating and apparent the futility of the Japanese government becomes. Gojira's nature as an animal doesn't fall under the treaties that limit Japan's military power. The potential of civilian casualties stops attack helicopters from firing. The fear of how the United States will respond causes government leaders to panic and freeze. While there's something noble about our characters refusing to cause any potential casualties from their attacks, their inaction only leads to worse losses. Meanwhile, so much of life as usual goes on as Gojira comes and goes. Decades ago, an atomic bomb attack seemed to stop the world from spinning on its axis. But the modern world never stops. Life goes on, even when an undefinable creature wreaks havoc only miles away. But every time Japan's forces finally become more aggressive in their tactics, they're too late. A step behind Gojira's latest form. But there is hope. Despite the enormity of Gojira's disaster, this is something that can be fought.
そう、生物です。ですから、人の力で駆除することができます。同じ自然災害と区分しても地震や台風とは違います。
Anno's film is filled with dozens of characters that illustrate the many layers of bureaucracy, news, military, and civilians involved in the disaster. But slowly, Shin Gojira reveals Deputy Chief Cabinet Secretary Rando Yaguchi, played by Hiroki Hasegawa, and Special Envoy for the President of the United States Kayoko Ann Patterson, played by Satomi Ishihara, as the main characters. Together, they represent personal ambition, as they hope to elevate their political statuses by saving Tokyo, as well as the inherent good within people, as they push aside that ambition to take a stand outside the bureaucratic process. And this is the collision between the banal governmental process and the existentially horrifying, a collision of man and God. Shin Gojira is divided into two halves, the first centered on the bureaucratic inaction that causes tragedy, and the second on the men and women who come together to save Japan. And these are split by the film's literal centerpiece, a sequence of horror that stands as the most terrifying and awe-inspiring moment in Godzilla's film history. Godzilla's radiation heat ray destruction of Tokyo, which kills the Prime Minister and much of his cabinet, is the Fukushima disaster taken to its most extreme possibility. In the aftermath, Yaguchi, Patterson, and the remaining governments scramble to stop Gojira before the United States drops a nuclear bomb on the kaiju. Multiple decades of nuclear horror stacking on top of each other in Japanese minds. Of course, to talk about Shin Godzilla, you have to discuss Anno's most defining work as a creator, Neon Genesis Evangelion, which originally ran from 1995 through 1996 with 26 episodes primarily written and directed by Anno. Evangelion focuses on teenage boy Shinji Ikari and his fellow mecha pilots who wage war against the monolithic kaiju known as Angels, using powerful Evangelion to stop the seemingly inevitable destruction of humanity. And while Anno's story builds off decades of mecha and kaiju stories that came before it, and many that he loved since he was a kid, what set the series apart at the time was its emotional core and grappling with issues of depression, mysticism, psychology, and the many Freudian self-destructive issues that define each of its characters. Over the course of the series, Shinji and the rest of the pilots at NERV are forced to come face to face with the end of mankind, while also uncovering the darker intentions of their organization. The arrival of the Angels, who only grow stronger and stronger over the series, and the meaning of life after the apocalyptic event of the Second Impact become increasingly metaphorical. And Evangelion was a deeply personal story for Anno, who greatly struggled with his own depression during the course of the series. And Evangelion began shortly after Japan's nationwide economic collapse, which set off the lost decade. As a result, the final episodes of Evangelion were thrown far off course from what was originally intended in favor of radical psychoanalysis of the central characters. But even after Evangelion was over, Anno couldn't let go of his series. Death and Rebirth and the end of Evangelion in 1997 provide a radically different conclusion for the series that reflects what Anno was going through. Ruminations on rebirth, loneliness, and an inability to reach out to others. Even then, Anno wasn't finished, as the rebuild of Evangelion revamped the entire series with 4 feature-length movies that drastically changed the story, once again reflecting Anno's shifting personal outlook. Evangelion is taken up by large swaths of tactical information dumps as its characters try to understand their enemy, formulate a plan, and use everything they have for their only shot at victory. Just like so much of Shin Gojira, the effect is that you feel the weight of the challenge and the intelligence of everyone involved. The difference is that humanity in Shin is limited in only being able to use what is available in reality. There are no Evas, no otherworldly spiritual connections, just human ingenuity. And in this, Shin becomes a tribute to the fortitude and intelligence of Japan, while Evangelion becomes a critique of mankind's failings. Anno's 2012 short film, Giant God Warrior Appears in Tokyo, which premiered alongside Evangelion 3.0, is a sort of middle ground between his anime and the way he would represent his ideas in Gojira. Giant God Warrior is all terrible spectacle, the apocalyptic end of Evangelion concentrated into a short burst. I sincerely thought that the world would end in the 20th century, said Anno. It was a big influence on Evangelion, which is about what happens after the world has been destroyed. At that time, a lot of Japanese anime dealt with what happens after a nuclear holocaust. And much like Yoshimitsu Banno's work on Gojira reflected Japan's animistic beliefs and connection to nature, Anno's work is very much a dark reflection of the same outlook, with Anno stating, "Japan is a country where a lot of typhoons and earthquakes strike. It's a country where merciless destruction happens naturally. It gives you a strong sense that God exists out there." The literal embodiment of God in creatures like the Angels, the God Warrior, and Gojira forces Anno's human characters to confront their own beliefs and choose how to act in the face of the apocalypse. But while Shinji Ikari might be the most pathetic mecha protagonist in history, his shift from being immobilized by his own self-doubts, to his destruction of the world, to his ability to change the world for the better, depending on the version that Anno has created, is all present within the many different characters of Shin Gojira. Ultimately, Anno's vision of humanity as tested by Godzilla is far more hopeful than most of Evangelion. In some ways, Shin Gojira is the final angel of Evangelion, a monolithic god being whose very nature breaks our understanding of the world. But he's also a reflection of the Evas, man-made destroyers that take an unknowable ancient creature and corrupt it. Just like the Evas are born from Adam, Gojira is an ancient sea creature mutated by feasting on radioactive waste dumped into the ocean. This alternate radioactive origin draws connections to the original Gojira's nature as a giant ancient sea creature awoken and angered by nuclear bomb testing. This new Gojira is like a cancerous tumor, evolving and growing and unable to understand its own nature, shell-shocked by its constant state of agony. And this is where Anno really sets his Gojira apart. This is the only Japanese Godzilla film that does not include the original in its canon, with every other era playing off the 1954 original to some degree. The difference lets the film take everything in a new direction and catch its characters off guard. A world where Godzilla has been encountered before is not the normal world, and Shin Godzilla is the first encounter between reality and fiction. Godzilla takes on 4 stages of evolution, which Toho originally resisted before encouragement from toymaker Bandai, transitioning from an unseen giant sea creature to an embryonic pink belly crawler with massive bleeding gills and no arms, to an upright air breather with stumpy little arms that looks like a malformed interpretation of the classic Gojira, and finally to a stock-still upright beast that towers above the city. Its indestructible skin like a cancerous stone, and its beady fish-like eyes lacking any emotion. Besides the occasional outburst and an enormous tail that constantly waves back and forth, this last form is almost passive in its destruction. It simply exists, until a stealth bomb attack overloads it, and Shin Gojira unleashes a radiation laser attack that cuts through Tokyo like a hot knife through butter. A tormented god laying waste to everything around it without a thought. More than any other Godzilla incarnation, Shin Gojira is a walking nuclear reactor, complete with radiation that has its own half-life, an internal cooling system and venting process for the heat it generates, and a radiation attack that is part self-defense, part necessity to stay alive. What also separates this version of Gojira is that it lacks almost all discernible emotions, making it completely inhuman. This isn't the friendly Showa defender or the Heisei antihero or the Millennium Punisher. Instead, Anno's Gojira switches between a sort of malevolent obliviousness and an unknowable pain. And it's because of this that Shin can be read through a variety of lenses that all depend on the perspective of the viewer. I would say that it's impossible to view this version as evil because it has no real intent behind its actions. It simply acts out of survival. A creature undergoing a rapid mutation that it doesn't understand, and suddenly confronted with an aggressive humanity it doesn't know. So it's possible to view Shin Gojira as a tragic figure that doesn't comprehend what's happening to it, as it rages and screams from a pain it can't define. But it's also possible to see Gojira as truly the god incarnate that it was named as, a figure far beyond humankind. There are many different metaphors present within the character of Shin Gojira himself throughout Anno's film, and when you look at the concept designs and deleted scenes that surround the movie, you can see these ideas growing larger and larger, almost creating a what-if scenario regarding Gojira's continued mutation. In one deleted scene, the flesh blasted off by the stealth bomber attack is shown to have grown eyeballs and teeth, illustrating Gojira to be in a constant state of evolution that defies being a single organism. The art of Shin Godzilla reveals that Anno and company created even further evolutionary stages for Gojira beyond what was seen in the film. The 5th form would create the legion we see briefly through self-generation as Gojira becomes able to fly. The 6th form creates limitless nuclear fusion and is able to travel through space. The 7th form contains a small universe within its body as it synthesizes elements as needed. And the 8th form transcends reality to become a true god that encompasses all life. These ideas showed the similarities between what Anno more thoroughly explored in Evangelion and the latent concepts within Shin Gojira, and they illustrate the true danger faced by the heroes of the film. The angels of Evangelion were partially inspired by kaiju like Gojira to tell a story of man fighting a war against gods beyond their comprehension, and Anno's version of Gojira is inspired by his Evangelion angels, elevating Gojira past previous statuses of prehistoric creature, Earth's defender, and even angry spirit to become a sort of god as well. There is a little bit of that old Toho competitive spirit that's alive in Shin Godzilla as well, as the studio made sure to announce that Shin was the tallest version of Godzilla to ever be brought to life, maxing out at 118.5 meters tall, more than 10 meters taller than Legendary's Gare Goji, which would later be topped by Dohei Goji of King of the Monsters. But it's the monolithic nature of Shin Goji that sets him apart, with the creature entirely brought to life by CGI. A giant puppet was created but didn't make it into the final cut, a first for Toho, who had used computer graphics sparingly, and portrayed by Mansei Nomura with motion capture. Shin Goji's 4th form is cracked and scarred, covered in lesions and open wounds that let us see the rising power within. And with the ability to shoot a purple concentrated radiation heat ray from his mouth, dorsal fins, and vestigial face-like tail, Shin Goji defies the traditions of the character in favor of something that lacks the humanity present in previous incarnations. Yet, despite its unique take, SHIN pays homage to so much Godzilla history. Multiple legacy sound effects are used, including roars from Showa and Heisei, as well as the sound of Destoroya's micro-oxygen beam, which connect the kaiju to his past versions and an enemy that shared a common origin. Composer Shiro Sagisu creates several haunting compositions, with Persecution of the Masses being mankind's prayer for an angry god's mercy, and Who Will Know being Gojira's painful lament. But multiple existing Akira Ifukube Godzilla tracks are used too, as well as Sagisu's decisive battle from Evangelion, all drawing connections to thematically similar works. Godzilla's landfall is November 3rd, the original Gojira's release date. Pivotal scientist Goro Maki has the same name as previous characters, and Maki's home of Odo Island is where the original Gojira first appeared, using Odo folklore to inspire the creature's name. And Rondo's Operation Yashiori, named after the sake that was used to defeat Yamato no Orochi in Japanese mythology, references the 8-headed dragon that inspired King Ghidorah, making Shin take the place of his greatest enemy. Maki is the ultimate cipher for Gojira's larger meaning, as the Japanese scientist, who left Japan after his wife died from radiation sickness and went to work for the US, knew about Gojira's festering existence under the sea for years, studying and understanding the creature's complex biology until he possibly unleashed it on Japan as a test. US nuclear cover-ups prevented Maki from making his knowledge public, and after he seemingly killed himself in Tokyo Bay right before Godzilla's first appearance, Maki left Japan with all the research they needed to stop the kaiju, along with a note: "I did as I pleased. Now you do the same." Maki's challenge, and the film itself, is a test of the nation. Can Japan overcome its limitations imposed by its own culture and decades of political ties with other nations? And Anno's film is ultimately hopeful, believing that yes, Japan can come together, beating back the feelings of hopelessness and uselessness to not only save itself, but reassert itself on the world stage, to leave its status as a post-war tributary state in an endless post-war, to, as a nation, do as it pleases. One of the keys to Shin Gojira's presentation is verisimilitude. Anno and company are working to present a story that asks, what if Godzilla appeared in modern-day Tokyo? And commit to the realism of that story in both the outcome of the narrative and the presentation of Godzilla in the real world. This makes Japan's victory so satisfying. Shin Gojira is more explicitly nationalistic than most Gojira movies, but is countered by Anno's critique of Japan's current reality. This is a story about how much it takes to save the world, and in the end, Anno leaves us with one final haunting image that illustrates how close to ultimate disaster we came, with the final shot closing in on Godzilla's tail, revealing strange humanoid creatures about to shed from him in the next stage of evolution. Will he return? What will happen when he does? With only 3,526 seconds to nuclear launch, the specter of nuclear disaster hangs over Japan, as the frozen kaiju monolith stands as a permanent fixture of its landscape. Life continuing on around it. Mankind must learn to coexist with Gojira, just like it must coexist with the disasters that have shaped Japan. Ishiro Honda's 1954 Gojira, Anno's 1995 Evangelion, and Anno's 2016 Shin Gojira are all connected through their inspiration from disasters that deeply affected Japan and sent its people spiraling in the aftermath. Shin Gojira is a collectivist story, a tokusatsu narrative that leaves humanity without a weapon akin to Mechagodzilla or an Eva to battle the kaiju menace of Gojira. Instead, humanity must elevate itself to the level of a god incarnate through humanist beliefs. Here, Gojira is a self-replicating, self-sustaining nuclear god whose many parts all act with one consciousness. So, in Shin's second half, as Japan and its allies begin to work together in harmony, it's no mistake that Anno places a focus on the many different elements needed to build a strategy to defeat Gojira. The people, the mechanisms, the labor, the science, the communications, the nations, all are given focus as the cells of a larger body working in concert. In some ways, it's a temporary, voluntary version of Evangelion's human instrumentality, creating a collective consciousness to rival Gojira's own self-sustaining godhood. And in this, we find the hopeful bent of Shin Gojira that counters its satirical edge. Every Godzilla film made by its home country is either a test, lament, or a celebration of Japan. The highs and lows, creative rebirths and stagnations, reinterpretations and homages of decades of Gojira highlight why the King of the Monsters has been able to stay popular for decades, constantly bringing in new fans without alienating the old. It's the flexibility of Godzilla and his eternally iconic status that is able to be used for everything from processing terrible losses to entertaining children. It's beautiful, terrible, and always fun. And for the last time in my Godzilla retrospective series, here's my personal ranking of every Godzilla movie, from worst to best. For more in-depth thoughts on each of these, see my previous videos on every Godzilla era. At 33, Godzilla 98. It's hard to really even categorize this as a true Godzilla movie, and while it's better made than some of the other films ranked higher on this list, its embrace of really dumb 90s blockbuster tropes and the way it interprets Goji as basically a T-Rex on steroids, mixed with some pretty bad human performances, puts this one at the very bottom. At 32, Godzilla vs. Megaguirus. To me, the absolute worst Japanese Gojira movie. The ideas of the G-Graspers, the Dimension Tide, and the original Gojira never dying are interesting, but the execution, like terrible choppy frame rates in the final battle, sink the whole movie until it abruptly, awkwardly ends. At 31, Godzilla vs. Megalon. Yes, Jet Jaguar is fun, and the reason for the movie being made in the first place, but I find vs. Megalon to be completely lacking in any structure, excitement, or memorable moments outside its very silly final battle. At 30, Godzilla Raids Again. Having this be the follow-up to the original classic and coming before the Showa era really got up and running doesn't do this movie any favors. So instead, it has half of the original's gravitas without the same metaphors and not much fun to make up for it. In the context of the entire franchise, it's a rushed sequel without the fun of the larger series. At 29, All Monsters Attack. A movie that's better than its reputation, but not really my style when it comes to what I like most in Godzilla movies. The positive message for children and Honda having fun with his kaiju are outweighed by the reused footage and goofiness. At 28, Son of Godzilla. As the full embrace of family-friendly Goji, this is an extremely silly movie, but it's also super slow-moving, which bogs down the campiness that is what most focus on in the film. Still, having Gojira become a father and teach Manila his kaiju tricks is fun. At 27, King Kong vs. Godzilla. The concept of Godzilla fighting King Kong alone is enough to engender a lot of goodwill as this third ever Gojira film embraces silliness for the first time. But some very sloppy fights and a lot of weird detours keep me from totally loving it. At 26, Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah, the first Heisei entry on this list. This time travel story is much more Showa style than a lot of its era. It's an extremely uneven film, with a first half marked by a lot of bad acting and Toho convinced that they needed to be like Back to the Future to be successful, countered by a great second half hero-villain reversal, and the super cool Mecha King Ghidorah. At 25, Tokyo SOS. The second half of the Millennium Mechagodzilla duology, this one removes the first film's leads in favor of a less interesting cast, and probably too much kaiju mythology building with the addition of Mothra. Still, Kiryu is awesome and the finale is great, providing closure to the larger story while not being as strong as the first half. At 24, Godzilla 2000. For a restart of a franchise, this one doesn't do much to establish a true new vision for the era, which is a little disappointing. Toho's embrace of CGI for the first time is spotty and very Sonic Adventure 1 in some places, but I really like the father-daughter lead combo and the use of a darker ending, even if it's all pretty standard Gojira stuff here. At 23, Invasion of Astro Monster. A very stock standard Showa Gojira story, complete with nefarious alien plots and Goji being a full-on hero of Earth. I like how unabashedly weird this one gets, and of course the hop dance, but there's not a lot to differentiate it as we move into the middle of the pack in this ranking. At 22, Godzilla vs. Hedorah. Yoshimitsu Banno's societal and ecological commentary movie has gained a much better reputation over the years, as the creator used his shot to critique Japan's major pollution problem and embrace a psychedelia of the era that felt extremely different for Showa. Still, I find it to be more ambitious than truly great, but the ambition gets it far. At 21, Godzilla vs. Mothra. Showa Mothra, anti-hero Godzilla, a deadbeat dad Indiana Jones, and the plot of the original Mothra vs. Godzilla create a strange brew of ideas. And much like the Showa era, Gojira is kind of an afterthought, playing as obstacle to Mothra and Batra, who are the focus of this ecologically minded story about the Earth reaching its tipping point. At 20, The Return of Godzilla. The Cold War rebirth of the king is a more serious and modern interpretation, upping the scale and technology while being a bit hamstrung by an unintentionally goofy Gojira look, and a plot that loses its metaphors in favor of spectacle. This is more a stage setting for the great films to come than a true classic in its own right. At 19, Ghidorah the Three-Headed Monster, the first real monster mash of the franchise, and the point at which Hiro Showa Goji is truly formed, as the counter to the true big bad of King Ghidorah. It's a classic of its era and really just a lot of fun. At 18, Terror of Mechagodzilla, the final Showa film and a darker story than most of the preceding films. Ishiro Honda's final Gojira movie sees the creator bringing back a sense of gravitas to his franchise, complete with a tragic victory and sympathetic villain. There's also Titanosaurus, I guess. At 17, Mothra vs. Godzilla. As the last villainous Goji movie in the Showa era, and the movie that brings in Mothra, this is the real expansion of the Godzilla universe. Any fan of the dynamic between these two will like the rarity of seeing Mothra and Godzilla as opponents. It's the magical bent to Godzilla that was common in the Showa era but much rarer later on that makes this fun. At 16, Godzilla vs. Space Godzilla. Probably the most cartoonish Heisei movie and one that's a total grab bag of ideas, with some working better than others. Still, having a variety of human motivations, the continued growth of Miki Sagusa, and an outlandish final battle make this really fun. At 15, Godzilla 2014. Edwards' movie is one of the most human Godzilla films, and a movie that's really focused on establishing a real-world awe in how Godzilla interacts with humanity. Still, the film withholds Godzilla for too long, which becomes frustrating, and our lead character of Ford isn't compelling, which drags the movie down when he's given the most screen time of any human or kaiju character. At 14, Godzilla vs. Gigan, one of the darkest Showa movies featuring one of the series' scariest villains. This one is another alien invasion plot, but with higher stakes. Having Godzilla bleed for the first time makes the typical Showa slam and bang fights feel a lot more dangerous than most others from this era. At 13, Godzilla vs. Kong. The newest film on this list, and more of a fun title fight than a complex narrative, the true star of the movie is Kong, given a full character arc unlike Godzilla, but incredible CGI, emotive kaiju, humongous fights, and wild environments balance out the film's shallowness that mostly abandons any sense of gravitas. At 12, Ibira, Horror of the Deep. A less discussed entry, and one that was originally meant to be a King Kong movie, which explains its island setting and why Godzilla likes the ladies. This is a fun and wild jungle adventure that has plenty of reveals, twists, and turns. Love the tropical setting, ocean action, and focused adventure story. At 11, Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla. Godzilla fights Mechagodzilla in this. That's gonna be big bonus points in any movie really. And the first time is a classic, with beam clashes, technological challenges, and massive warfare on display, making this feel bigger than your average Showa movie. King Caesar is also here, I guess. At 10, Destroy All Monsters. In what was originally meant to be the final Godzilla movie, this monster mash brings in your favorites, your not-so-favorites, and some obscure kaiju to fill out the ranks as needed. The first half of the film is too slow, but having everyone come together to curb stomp Ghidorah makes up for it. At 9, Final Wars. Like the early 2000s got pregnant and gave birth to a movie. It's a sci-fi karate movie that becomes a lightning-fast monster mash as Godzilla rips through every kaiju Toho could put on screen. The CGI and speed ramping is used too much for how subpar they are, but it's entertaining and insane in ways that it mostly means to be. At 8, Godzilla, Mothra, King Ghidorah, Giant Monsters All-Out Attack. A great grim breath of fresh air within the Millennium era, as an extremely rare, truly evil Gojira punishes Japan as the embodiment of everyone killed because of the country in World War II. Shusuke Kaneko brings the innate terror of his Gamera trilogy to Gojira, which doesn't quite match the heights of his trilogy because of its central metaphor informing less of the second half. But it's a great dark experience with a lot of great fights. Plus there's a very cute Baragon. At 7, Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla 2. Everything from here on up honks. This is where the Heisei era's interconnected storyline starts to really pay off, as classic Showa concepts are brought into the modern day, including Mechagoji, Rodan, and now the son of Godzilla. The film forces you to shift your allegiances between Godzilla and the Mecha team for a complex final battle, and Super Mechagodzilla is my favorite version of the character. At 6, Godzilla, King of the Monsters. Huge, ambitious, crazy, and with just enough ecological metaphor to power its fights, while also using its human characters as counterpoints to the kaiju. KOTM has great action, cool designs, a balance between gravitas and fun, a reckoning between humanity and nature, and one of the best scores in the franchise by Bear McCreary. At 5, Against Mechagodzilla. I love Kiryu as an unpredictable update of Mechagodzilla, and Akane is the strongest Millennium protagonist. A very lean Godzilla movie that knows exactly what it wants to do, which definitely can't be said for all of the Millennium movies. Great fights, tight pacing, good effects. It's a one-woman versus Godzilla type of story, but it's less about the compulsion to destroy the monster, and more about Akane trying to overcome her self-doubts. The best Millennium movie. At 4, Godzilla vs. Biollante. A compelling and tragic human story, one of the best kaiju ever made, a tough and scary Goji, great gross and explosive fights, and the movie that put the Heisei era on track, with a pseudoscience fight for survival that will be replicated many times over. The terrifying nature of Biollante being a tortured creature that knows it shouldn't exist, and Godzilla being compelled to fight what is essentially himself corrupted, makes this the most original of its era, and showcases the potential of Godzilla stories. At 3, Godzilla vs. Destoroyah. Absolutely killer kaiju designs, crazy bits of horror, truly high stakes, a connection to the original Gojira, and an amazing emotional send-off for the king. Godzilla and Destoroyah are both metaphors for man's scientific overreach and capacity for destruction, but are also given strong characterization. A beautiful and sad ending that retroactively strengthens the Heisei era. At 2, Ishiro Honda's original Gojira. This film is high art, and one that hasn't lost its strength and fear almost 70 years later. As a movie that is designed to confront a nation's fears and losses, it holds nothing back in the way it actively mourns so much loss, which is all channeled through its King Kaiju. It's also anchored by great performances and special effects that, while dated, perfectly capture the otherworldly terror of Gojira. By the end, we mourn again and hope for a better world that won't repeat its past mistakes. And at number 1, Shin Gojira. I believe that Anno's film can stand shoulder to shoulder with any sci-fi, disaster, political, and monster movie classic. It's all of them at once, and one of the rare films that captures the sociological importance of Gojira while being completely original. I don't think I have to say much more about it, I've already said it all in this video. And with that, I've come to the end of my Godzilla retrospective series. When it began, I was a casual but interested viewer. Now, I'm a devoted fan. And as the Reiwa era has given birth to multiple interpretations like the Godzilla Earth trilogy and Godzilla Singular Point, along with news that another MonsterVerse movie and another live-action Gojira film is on the horizon, I'm excited for whatever comes next. Because no matter what the world needs from him, one thing is certain: Godzilla will always be the king. Thanks for watching today's video, my final retrospective on Gojira. And after 5 videos that add up to more than 2 hours in length total, I don't know what else there is to say. I just want to thank you all for following me along on this crazy kaiju journey. It's been a lot of fun to make, and a lot of work, but mostly a lot of fun. I have really loved digging deep into Gojira lore, and the process has taken me from a casual Godzilla viewer to a really devoted fan. Godzilla is truly fantastic, and there is just so much that can be said about him, which I guess I've done. It was always the plan to cap off this whole series with a Shin Gojira specific video, and the process of doing this has also led me to dive deep into Evangelion as well, which of course if anyone has seen the series knows is a truly insane anime, but it's totally fascinating. Maybe I'll make an Evangelion video someday. Also, over the course of all this time, I've watched a lot of Gamera movies as well, and I might be interested in making a Gamera retrospective as well, specifically one on Shusuke Kaneko's Heisei Gamera trilogy, because that is a fantastic series of movies that rivals any of the best kaiju films. And there is one more potential Godzilla retrospective that I could do, which would be a retrospective on all of the animated Godzilla stuff, such as the Godzilla Earth trilogy and Singular Point, and even the American spin-off spin-off cartoon from the 90s. If you're interested in any of those videos, let me know, because if I know that there's a lot of people who would watch them, I'd bump them up higher in my schedule. After all of these videos, I just want to say thank you for watching, and I'd like to hear your thoughts on Godzilla, your rankings on the various films. Maybe you don't have to rank them all, but give me your top 5. Talk about your favorite eras, Heisei is my favorite era, and any just general thoughts on Shin Gojira or any Godzilla just overall. There's so much that can be said about Godzilla, and so many people have, and many more people will after I'm done here. But this has been a truly fantastic, fun, satisfying thing to do. Maybe the most satisfying series that I've ever done on my channel. As always, I'd like to give a huge thank you to my patrons for their continued support, and if you'd like to be a patron, it's only $1 a month for early access to every video and exclusive Patreon audio reviews. Until next time, I hope that you're taking care of yourselves, watching out for one another, and watching some Godzilla movies. See you again soon.